What started as a missing person report would soon unravel into a tale of lies, betrayal, and the chilling lengths one man would go to bury the truth. Cohasset, Massachusetts. A quaint coastal town where the streets are lined with charm, and the days pass without much disruption. But on January 1st, the peace of this picturesque community was shattered by a mystery so dark it would leave the entire nation questioning what goes on behind closed doors. Camille Sanders, a 38-year-old real estate executive, was the epitome of success and resilience. Known for her vibrant personality and tireless work ethic, Camille was a loving mother of 3 and a devoted wife. To those who knew her, she was the rock of her family, a woman who had seemingly mastered the balance between professional ambition and personal commitment. Her husband, Darnell Sanders, was her opposite in many ways. A 42-year-old artist whose dreams of success had been eclipsed by financial struggles and mounting insecurities. As Camille's career flourished, Darnell's resentment quietly simmered, a storm brewing behind the image of a supportive husband. And then, on New Year's Day, Camille vanished. Darnell claimed she left early for a business trip, but her colleagues grew suspicious when she failed to appear at a crucial meeting. Calls went unanswered, messages unreturned. Soon concern turned to alarm, and the police were called in to investigate. What they uncovered was far from the routine case of a missing person. The polished facade of the Sanders home hid a labyrinth of lies and secrets. A bloody knife tucked away in the basement. Google searches so incriminating they read like a confession. How long before a body starts to smell? Best ways to dispose of a body. And then, the most damning of all, can you be charged with murder without a body? Investigators followed a trail of evidence that would lead to the discovery of garbage bags that held the horrifying remnants of what should have been a loving marriage. A hacksaw, bloody rugs, Camille's jewelry. And piece by piece, the grim truth of what happened to Camille Sanders began to emerge. This is not just the story of a crime. It's the story of a marriage built on a foundation of control, jealousy, and fear. A story that exposes the terrifying truth about how little we sometimes know the people we think we love. Stay with us as we uncover the haunting details of Camille's disappearance and the devastating secrets her husband worked so hard to hide. This is a tale of betrayal, obsession, and the unimaginable lengths one man would go to, all in an effort to cover his tracks. Before we dive into the rest of this gripping story, if you haven't already, take a moment to subscribe to the channel. By subscribing, you'll never miss out as we continue to bring true crime stories like this one to light. And don't forget to turn on notifications so you're the first to know when new episodes drop. These stories deserve to be heard, and your support helps us keep them alive. Now, let's get back to the story. It was New Year's Eve at the Sanders home, a modest but comfortable house in Cohasset, Massachusetts. Camille had invited a close family friend to join her and Darnell for a quiet celebration. The table was set, champagne glasses sparkled under the soft glow of the dining room light, and laughter filled the room. On the surface, it was the perfect way to ring in the new year. A loving couple, a trusted friend, and the promise of brighter days ahead. Camille, ever the gracious host, was lively and engaging, chatting about her plans for the coming months, her excitement for new opportunities, and her dreams for her family. Darnell, however, seemed withdrawn. He smiled when appropriate, nodded along with the conversation, but his eyes rarely left Camille. The friend would later recall that the atmosphere felt off. There were small, fleeting moments that didn't sit right. Darnell's comments, subtle but pointed, often steered the conversation toward Camille's busy schedule. He joked about her long hours at work, her constant traveling, her late nights at the office. At first, the remark seemed harmless, playful even, but there was an edge to his tone that was hard to ignore. Camille brushed it off, laughing lightly, as she reassured him, "You know how it is, in my line of work." But beneath her confident exterior, there was a flicker of discomfort, a hesitation in her voice that didn't go unnoticed. As midnight approached, the group gathered around the television to watch the ball drop. The countdown began. Camille and their friend cheered, raising their glasses in celebration. Darnell, however, stayed quiet, clinking his glass against hers with a faint smile before turning his gaze elsewhere. By the time the clock struck 12, the mood had shifted. Camille excused herself, saying she was tired and needed to get some rest. She wished her guests a good night and disappeared down the hallway. It would be the last time anyone outside the Sanders household would ever see her again. In the early hours of January 1st, Darnell would later recount that Camille had gone to rest after the small celebration. She had been tired, he said, worn out from the long holiday season and preparing for her upcoming work commitments. According to Darnell, Camille had plans to leave early for a business trip in Washington, D.C., so it wasn't unusual that she excused herself and went to bed. But as investigators would later uncover, this was the last confirmed moment Camille Sanders was seen alive. 3 days passed before anyone outside her family noticed something was wrong. Camille's employer, concerned by her unexplained absence from an important meeting, reached out to check on her. When they couldn't reach her and realized she hadn't shown up for work in Washington, alarms were raised. The missing person report was filed, and police began their investigation. Darnell told authorities that Camille had left the house early on January 1st for her work trip. He described her departure as rushed, stating that she had left in a rideshare, luggage in hand, heading for the airport. But as investigators started digging into her movements, nothing about Darnell's account added up. There was no record of a rideshare picking her up that morning. Camille's flight to Washington, scheduled for January 3rd, had never been checked into. Her car remained parked in the driveway, untouched. And then there were the items she left behind. Camille's luggage, personal belongings, and even her work phone were all found inside the house. It was as though Camille Sanders had vanished into thin air, leaving no trace of her journey. And with every question investigators asked, more inconsistencies in Darnell's story began to surface. Friends described the Sanders marriage as strained, with Darnell becoming increasingly controlling in the months leading up to Camille's disappearance. While outwardly their relationship appeared stable, those close to the couple began noticing cracks that hinted at deeper troubles. Camille's success in the real estate world was a source of pride for her, but for Darnell, it seemed to be a growing point of tension. As Camille thrived professionally, Darnell's own career as an artist stagnated. The imbalance in their accomplishments weighed heavily on him, creating a sense of resentment that he struggled to hide. Darnell's insecurities began manifesting in subtle but telling ways. Friends recalled how he would question Camille's late hours at work or her frequent business trips. What started as casual comments turned into pointed remarks and accusatory questions. But it didn't stop there. Darnell's suspicions of infidelity began to consume him. Despite having no evidence, he became convinced that Camille's busy schedule was a cover for something more. Unable to shake his doubts, Darnell took drastic measures. He hired a private investigator to follow Camille, hoping to uncover proof of an affair. The investigator documented Camille's movements for weeks, tracking her every step from the office to meetings and back home. But there was nothing out of the ordinary. No secret rendezvous. No clandestine phone calls. Nothing to validate Darnell's growing paranoia. Instead of easing his mind, the lack of evidence seemed to fuel his obsession. If there was no proof, Darnell reasoned, it must mean Camille was simply more skilled at hiding the truth. Friends later shared that Camille had become increasingly withdrawn in her marriage. She confided in a close colleague that Darnell's behavior was becoming difficult to handle, describing how his need for control had started to suffocate her. Still, she was determined to make the relationship work, for the sake of their family and their 3 children. But for Darnell, the idea of losing Camille was unbearable. Whether it was to another man or to her growing independence, he couldn't stand the thought of a future where she wasn't by his side. It was this obsession, investigators believed, that ultimately pushed him over the edge. Unable to confront his own insecurities and consumed by jealousy, Darnell began to view Camille not as his partner, but as a problem he needed to solve. The morning of January 1st started like any other, but by the end of that day, the Sanders household would become the scene of an unimaginable tragedy. According to investigators, it was in the basement of their home that the tension between Darnell and Camille reached its breaking point. Darnell, consumed by his growing jealousy and paranoia, confronted Camille. What began as a heated conversation quickly escalated into an argument. Darnell accused Camille of being unfaithful, his voice rising as he demanded answers that she didn't have. Camille denied the accusations, insisting that his suspicions were unfounded, but her denials only fueled his anger. As the argument intensified, years of resentment and insecurity boiled to the surface. Darnell's words became sharper, his tone more threatening. Camille, known for her composure, tried to de-escalate the situation. She told him she didn't have time for his accusations, that she had work to prepare for and needed to leave early the next morning. To Darnell, her dismissal of his concerns was the final straw. It wasn't just her words that angered him. It was the perceived indifference, the way she seemed to prioritize her work over their marriage, over him. Investigators believe it was in that moment, fueled by rage and a sense of losing control, that Darnell snapped. In the basement of their home, where tools and storage boxes lined the walls, Darnell grabbed a kitchen knife that had been left near a stack of unpacked holiday decorations. The details of what happened next are pieced together through the physical evidence left behind, a struggle, signs of resistance, and the fatal act of violence that ended Camille's life. The confrontation had turned into a crime of passion, one that Darnell couldn't take back. As the reality of what he had done began to sink in, Darnell was left with a devastating question. What now? The evidence would later show that in the hours following Camille's death, Darnell remained in the basement. Blood spatter on the floor and walls indicated where the attack occurred, while traces of bleach suggested an immediate attempt to clean up the scene. But the task ahead of him was far greater than he had anticipated. Darnell's next steps, as investigators would later uncover, showed a chilling level of calculation. Camille's body, the blood-stained knife, and the remnants of their argument now became problems he had to solve. And for Darnell Sanders, solving those problems meant taking drastic and unthinkable measures. With Camille's lifeless body in the basement, Darnell Sanders faced the chilling reality of what he had done. But instead of turning himself in or calling for help, he made a calculated decision to cover his tracks and ensure no one would ever uncover the truth. The first step in his plan was preparation. In the hours immediately following the crime, Darnell left the house under the pretense of running errands. Surveillance footage and receipts would later reveal that he visited multiple stores across town. At a local hardware store, he purchased industrial-strength cleaning supplies, bleach, gloves, scrub brushes, and garbage bags. At another location, he picked up a hacksaw, zip ties, and duct tape. Each item was chosen with a grim purpose in mind. Investigators would later reconstruct his actions during this period, noting how methodical he appeared to be. Darnell made no attempt to hide these purchases, using his own credit card and driving his own car. It was as though he believed he could outsmart the system, that his plan would ensure he was never caught. Back at the house, Darnell began the painstaking process of cleaning the crime scene. Evidence suggests he worked for hours in the basement, scrubbing the floors and walls in an effort to remove all traces of blood. The smell of bleach lingered in the air, but even his efforts couldn't erase the evidence entirely. Once the basement was as clean as he could make it, Darnell turned his attention to Camille's body. The hacksaw, still in its original packaging, became a critical tool in his plan. Investigators later discovered that Darnell had used it to dismember Camille's body, making it easier to transport and dispose of her remains. The next phase of his plan involved disposing of the evidence in multiple locations. Darnell carefully wrapped each part of Camille's remains in garbage bags, sealing them with duct tape. These bags, along with other incriminating items like the broken knife and bloodied rugs, were loaded into his car. Over the course of several days, Darnell drove to different areas around the city, discarding the bags in dumpsters and remote locations. His intention was clear. By spreading out the evidence, he hoped to make it nearly impossible for anyone to piece together what had happened. But even as Darnell carried out his plan, he couldn't account for every detail. Surveillance cameras captured him disposing of the bags near his mother's apartment complex, and the items he left behind would eventually lead investigators straight to him. What Darnell didn't anticipate was that the truth has a way of surfacing, no matter how carefully it's hidden. And with every discarded bag, every receipt, and every surveillance clip, the walls of his carefully constructed alibi began to crumble. As investigators began piecing together the timeline of Camille's supposed departure, they quickly uncovered a series of troubling inconsistencies in Darnell's account. Darnell had maintained that Camille left their home in the early hours of January 1st, heading to Washington, D.C. for work. He described how she had hurriedly packed her bags, called a rideshare, and said goodbye before leaving for her trip. But when police requested surveillance footage from the neighborhood, there was no evidence to support his claim. Cameras positioned near the Sanders home showed no sign of Camille leaving the property that morning. No rideshare vehicle was seen arriving or departing. And most critically, no footage captured Camille herself stepping outside. The house remained quiet and still during the hours Darnell described her departure. Investigators knew that if Camille had truly left, it wasn't captured by any of the cameras positioned around the property or along nearby streets. Police also began cross-referencing Darnell's story with travel records. They contacted rideshare companies to confirm whether a vehicle had been requested to pick up Camille from their address. But once again, there was nothing. No rideshare requests, no driver logs, no trace of a trip to the airport. The inconsistencies didn't stop there. When police checked flight records, they found that Camille's scheduled trip to Washington wasn't until January 3rd. The flight she had booked remained unused, and there were no rebookings or cancellations on her behalf. Back at the house, investigators noticed more red flags. Camille's luggage, which Darnell insisted she had taken with her, was still in the bedroom closet, untouched. Her car sat parked in its usual spot in the driveway, undisturbed since before the New Year's celebration. And perhaps most alarming, Camille's work phone, a device she rarely went anywhere without, was found on the kitchen counter, its notifications piling up with missed calls and messages. The evidence painted a very different picture from the one Darnell had described. Camille hadn't left the house, at least not on her own terms. Investigators now faced a troubling question. If Camille hadn't left for Washington, then where was she? And why was her husband's account so riddled with contradictions? As they pressed Darnell for answers, his calm demeanor began to falter. He stuck to his story, repeating the same details as if rehearsed. But the gaps in his explanation grew more glaring with each passing day. It was no longer a question of whether something had happened to Camille. It was now a question of how much Darnell Sanders knew and what he was hiding. As detectives dug deeper into the case, they uncovered a chilling digital footprint that would take their investigation in a horrifying direction. Using a warrant to access Darnell Sanders' personal devices, investigators began to analyze his online activity in the days leading up to and following Camille's disappearance. What they found was not only disturbing, but left little doubt that foul play was involved. Among the search history on a shared family tablet and Darnell's personal devices were phrases that stopped the investigators in their tracks. How long before a body starts to smell? This search was conducted just hours after Camille was last seen. It was followed by others that were equally alarming. Best ways to dispose of a body. Can you be charged with murder without a body? The timing of these searches was damning. The very morning Darnell claimed Camille had left for her trip, he was sitting at home typing these questions into a search engine. But the list didn't end there. Investigators uncovered an unsettling sequence of queries, each one painting a more vivid picture of what had unfolded in the Sanders home. How to clean blood from a concrete floor. Does bleach destroy DNA evidence? How to dismember a body. Each search was a step-by-step guide to covering up a crime, and the level of detail suggested careful planning. Detectives were no longer just dealing with a case of a missing person. They were looking at what appeared to be a premeditated act of violence, followed by an attempt to erase all traces of the victim. Darnell, when confronted with the evidence, insisted the searches were innocent. He claimed he had been watching true crime shows and that his curiosity got the better of him. But detectives weren't convinced. The searches were not scattered or random. They were precise and deliberate, carried out during key moments of the timeline investigators were reconstructing. And as more evidence began to emerge, it became harder for Darnell to explain away the growing list of damning discoveries. The digital trail was clear, methodical, and impossible to ignore. And for the detectives working the case, it was a roadmap to the truth, a truth that Darnell Sanders was desperately trying to keep hidden. As the investigation progressed, detectives obtained a search warrant for the Sanders home, hoping to find any physical evidence that could support their growing suspicions. What they discovered would confirm their worst fears. The first discovery came in the basement, a space that investigators would later describe as eerily clean, yet not clean enough to hide the truth. Underneath a freshly mopped floor, forensic specialists detected faint traces of blood. Further testing would reveal that the blood matched Camille Sanders' DNA. Nearby, they found something even more disturbing. Hidden behind a storage shelf was a broken knife. The blade was stained with dried blood, and the handle bore traces of human tissue. It was clear that the knife had been used in a violent struggle. DNA analysis would later confirm that the blood and tissue belonged to Camille. But the discovery didn't end there. Investigators found cleaning supplies scattered throughout the basement. Bottles of bleach, rubber gloves, and scrub brushes, all appearing to have been recently used. It was a stark contrast to the story Darnell had been telling, a story where no foul play had occurred, and Camille had simply walked out of their lives. The evidence told a different tale. It painted a picture of desperation, of someone trying to erase what had taken place in that house. Detectives meticulously collected every piece of evidence, knowing that each item brought them closer to uncovering the truth. As they worked, questions loomed over their minds. If this was just the beginning of what they were finding, How much more evidence of Camille's fate was yet to be discovered? The discovery of blood in the basement and the broken knife left little doubt that violence had occurred inside the Sanders home. But it also raised chilling new questions. If Camille had been harmed here, where was she now? As the walls of Darnell's carefully constructed lies began to collapse, investigators knew they were on the verge of uncovering something far more horrifying than they had initially anticipated. And with each new piece of evidence, the noose around Darnell's story tightened further. As investigators widened their search, they turned their attention to areas beyond the Sanders home. One key location drew immediate scrutiny: Darnell's mother's apartment, located in a neighboring town. It was here, in a nearby dumpster, that police would make their most disturbing discovery yet. Acting on a tip and armed with a warrant, detectives combed through the trash in and around the apartment complex. What they found left no room for speculation. Inside several garbage bags were items that could only be described as pieces of a horrifying puzzle. Among the first items recovered was a hacksaw, its blade stained with what appeared to be dried blood. This tool, investigators believed, had been used to dismember Camille Sanders' body. A grim realization that added a new and chilling layer to the case. There were also bloody rugs, the fibers soaked through with evidence of violence. Forensic analysis would later confirm that the blood matched Camille's DNA. The rugs, investigators suspected, had been used to transport or conceal her remains. As detectives continued to sift through the bags, they uncovered more personal items that once belonged to Camille herself. Among them was a gold necklace she had been wearing the night of her disappearance, a piece of jewelry that friends said she never took off. Alongside it was her ID, a chilling reminder that no matter how hard Darnell tried to erase her existence, these remnants of her life remained. The findings were devastatingly clear. Each bag contained evidence that tied Darnell to Camille's disappearance, and the sheer brutality of what they found painted a picture of a man who had gone to extraordinary lengths to cover his tracks. The dumpster search had provided investigators with the physical evidence they needed to build their case, but it also left them with haunting questions. What exactly had happened in the hours after Camille was last seen? And how had Darnell Sanders, a man she trusted, taken such deliberate, calculated steps to dispose of her so completely? With every discovery, the image of what happened to Camille Sanders came into sharper focus. And as investigators prepared to confront Darnell with this damning evidence, they knew the truth was no longer something he could hide. As the evidence against Darnell Sanders continued to pile up, investigators moved quickly to ensure he would face justice. The first step was to bring him in for questioning, a process that would expose the cracks in his carefully constructed facade. Darnell initially maintained his story, repeating the same account he had given from the beginning, that Camille had left early for a work trip to Washington, D.C., and that he hadn't seen or heard from her since. But detectives, armed with a growing mountain of evidence, knew this version of events didn't hold up. The inconsistencies in his timeline, the surveillance footage showing no record of Camille leaving the house, and the discovery of her personal belongings all pointed to one undeniable fact: Camille never left their home alive. Despite Darnell's insistence on his innocence, the police were ready to take the next step. On the evening of January 8th, Darnell was officially arrested for misleading the investigation. The charge was a critical move, giving investigators more time to continue building their case while keeping him in custody. As the days passed, the evidence against him became overwhelming. The search of his home had revealed blood in the basement and a broken knife with traces of Camille's DNA. The dumpster search near his mother's apartment had turned up the hacksaw, bloodied rugs, Camille's jewelry, and her ID. And then there were his internet searches, the digital trail that outlined in chilling detail his efforts to plan and cover up the crime. Investigators presented the findings to the district attorney, who concluded there was enough evidence to charge Darnell with murder. The charge was formalized on January 18th, just weeks after Camille's disappearance. When confronted with the evidence, Darnell showed no signs of remorse. He denied any involvement in Camille's death, claiming that the items found in the dumpster had been planted and that his internet searches had been taken out of context. But his explanations rang hollow in the face of the facts. The trial would be a long and grueling process, one that would lay bare the darkest details of what had happened to Camille Sanders. But for investigators, the arrest was the first step toward holding Darnell accountable for his actions. The once charming artist who had painted a picture of a perfect life was now the central figure in a murder case that had captivated an entire community. And as the trial date approached, the full extent of Darnell's deception and his cruelty would be revealed. The trial of Darnell Sanders began with intense public scrutiny as people across the nation watched to see how the case would unfold. The prosecution came prepared, armed with a mountain of evidence that painted a grim and compelling picture of what had happened to Camille Sanders. From the outset, prosecutors focused on the physical evidence that had been recovered during the investigation. They presented the blood found in the basement of the Sanders home, linking it directly to Camille through DNA analysis. They described how the broken knife, hidden behind a storage shelf, was stained with Camille's blood and bore signs of being used in a violent struggle. Then came the items found in the dumpster near Darnell's mother's apartment. Piece by piece, prosecutors revealed the grisly contents of the garbage bags, the blood-soaked rugs, the hacksaw with dried blood on its blade, Camille's necklace, and her ID. Each item tied Darnell to the crime, leaving little room for doubt. But perhaps the most damning evidence was Darnell's own digital footprint. The prosecution detailed his internet searches in the days surrounding Camille's disappearance, reading each one aloud to the jury. How long before a body starts to smell? Best ways to dispose of a body. Can you be charged with murder without a body? Each search painted a picture of a man who was not only planning to commit a crime, but was also preparing to cover it up. The defense, however, fought back with a singular focus: the lack of a body. They argued that without Camille's remains, it was impossible to definitively prove that she had been murdered. They suggested that the evidence was circumstantial, that the blood and items found in the dumpster could have been planted, and that the prosecution was asking the jury to draw conclusions without concrete proof. The defense also tried to humanize Darnell, painting him as a devoted husband and father who had been overwhelmed by stress and financial pressures. They claimed the internet searches, while alarming, could be explained as the morbid curiosity of a man who consumed true crime stories, not the premeditation of a killer. But the prosecution countered every argument. They pointed out that while Camille's body had not been recovered, the sheer weight of the evidence was undeniable. The knife, the blood, the cleaning supplies, the hacked-up remains of Camille's belongings, everything pointed to Darnell. Over the course of the trial, witness testimony further solidified the case. Friends and co-workers of Camille described how she had confided in them about Darnell's controlling behavior and growing paranoia. They spoke of how she had become withdrawn, fearful of what might happen if she challenged him. And while Darnell chose not to testify in his own defense, his demeanor throughout the trial did little to sway the jury. He sat stone-faced as the prosecution laid out the events leading up to Camille's disappearance, his expression unchanging even as the most damning evidence was presented. In the end, It was the totality of the evidence that left the jury with little doubt. The prosecution had constructed a narrative so detailed, so supported by physical and digital proof, that the absence of a body no longer seemed to matter. As the closing arguments were made, the weight of the case hung heavy in the courtroom. For the jury, the decision they faced was clear. Did the evidence prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Darnell Sanders had murdered his wife and worked meticulously to hide the crime? The answer to that question would soon bring this tragic case to its conclusion. In a shocking turn of events, after months of denial and mounting evidence against him, Darnell Sanders finally confessed to the crime. It was a moment that left even the most seasoned investigators stunned. Under the weight of overwhelming evidence and the pressure of a trial that had painted him as a cold and calculating murderer, Darnell broke his silence. Sitting in an interrogation room, he finally admitted to what he had done. Darnell described, in chilling detail, the events that unfolded after he killed Camille. He admitted to using the hacksaw to dismember her body in the basement, explaining how he had carefully wrapped each piece in garbage bags to make disposal easier. He spoke of the cleaning supplies he purchased, the hours he spent scrubbing away the blood, and his belief that he could erase all traces of what had happened. He recounted how he had driven to multiple locations over several days, dumping the bags in dumpsters and remote areas around the city. His goal, he said, was to ensure that no single location held enough evidence to incriminate him. Despite the confession, Darnell refused to disclose the exact locations where he disposed of Camille's remains. When pressed for details, he claimed he didn't remember or offered vague answers that led investigators nowhere. It was a final act of control, leaving Camille's loved ones without the closure of a proper burial. For the prosecution, the confession was both a victory and a frustration. While it confirmed what they already knew, it left unanswered questions that would continue to haunt the case. Darnell Sanders was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He now sits in a maximum security facility, far from the life he once knew, surrounded by the consequences of his actions. Meanwhile, the Sanders home sits empty, a stark reminder of the tragedy that unfolded within its walls. The basement, once a mundane storage space, is now a place that investigators and those who knew the family will never forget. And Camille? Her name lives on as a symbol of resilience, a woman whose life was tragically cut short by the person she trusted most. Darnell Sanders now sits in prison, haunted by his actions, while Camille's body remains unrecovered, a chilling reminder of how secrets can destroy lives. And that concludes the tragic story of Camille Sanders, a case of betrayal, obsession, and the devastating consequences of unchecked jealousy. Thank you for watching. If you found this story compelling, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment below with your thoughts. We'd love to hear your theories and insights on this case. And don't forget to share this video with your friends and family. Join us soon for another gripping tale of true crime. A story that will leave you questioning everything you think you know about trust and betrayal. You won't want to miss it.